Great, it has started.
Okay. Excellent. So it's so nice to see many familiar faces, but also the other faces that are, at least to me, are not familiar. And thank you very much for all of our virtual guests that are joining us today. I am Karma Ben Yochanan. I'm a professor of Jewish-Christian Relations at the Faculty of Theology at the Humboldt University of Berlin. And I'm very excited to host a very special book launch of a very special book, Elad Lapidot's Jews Out of the Question, a critique of anti-Anti-Semitism, which was published just a few months ago by SUNY Press. And it is not often that one has the opportunity to celebrate such an outstanding book that penetrates so deeply into the sensitive and urgent matter that it inquires, and that poses such profound intellectual challenges to our common understandings. And this evening we have a chance to do that along with Elad Lapidot, the author, and three other wonderful speakers, all of whom are incredibly original intellectuals, Gila Nijjar, Menachem Lorberbaum, and Vivian Liska. And I would also add that Gil and Menachem were also the readers of Elad's Habilitation, and the book is based on that Habilitation, so they have an especially intimate relation to this book. And I will adhere to my role as host and won't take much time from the discussion. But since this is a new book that I presume not many of you have had a chance to read yet, so I would like to provide a very brief introduction to the book before I turn to our speakers. Elad's Jews Out of the Question demonstrates how post-Holocaust philosophy has identified the fundamental evil of anti-Semitic thought, not in thinking against Jews, but in thinking of Jews. In other words, Elad argues, what philosophy has been denouncing as anti-Semitic is the figure of the Jew in thought. Paradoxically, it is precisely the opposition to anti-Semitism that has been generating in post-Holocaust philosophy a rejection of Jewish thought. The book offers a series of critical readings in prominent political philosophers, from Adorno, Horkheimer, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Hannah Arendt, to Alain Badiou and Jean-Luc Nancy. In the second part of the book, Elad examines the epistemo-political links of race discourse to modern notions of religion, language, history, the nation, and the state in works by Renan, Bauer, Marx, Marr, and, lest we forget, Hitler. After this general depiction that explains what the book is about, I would also like to read to you a short paragraph from the book itself, so that you could also get a glimpse of the delicate work that the author invested in attentively leading the readers hand in hand through a complex and carefully structured argument. So I'm now reading from the introduction. Designating the critique of the disfigured Jew, anti-Anti-Semitism, an expression that sounds like a parody on Hegel, until you read Hegel, performatively attempts to reinscribe the de-epistemized Jew, disrobed of all concept, back into the epistemic realm, not only remembered, but reintroduced into thinking, into the conceptual event of opposition, of contradiction and negation of machloikes, which is the element of knowledge insofar as it is temporal, insofar as it is thought. Anti-Anti-Semitism is accordingly an introduction to Jewish thought, to thinking as it has historically been deployed in and as Jewish being, to thinking as machloikes. Anti-Semitism is introduction to Talmud. So for those of you who are interested in purchasing the book, it could be purchased now in discount. So we are sending you the link to the discount page in the website of the press via chat, so you can see it there and buy the book to yourselves. And now I would just go ahead with a few technicalities. If you have any questions, so please write them on the chat. The chat would be read only by the hosts. And eventually we will, if we have enough time for discussion, which we hopefully we will, Then we will pick a few of them. We won't have a lot of time anyway, but hopefully some of them could be read, and the speakers could also respond to your questions. Anything else I should have mentioned? I think not. So everybody, the speakers should speak around 15 to 20 minutes, and then Elad will have also the opportunity to respond to a discussion that will surely be very, very interesting. So our first guest today is Gil Anidjar. Gil, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work, teaches in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies, and the Department of Religion at Columbia University. He's the author, among others, of The Jew, the Arab, A History of the Enemy, Semites, Race, Religion, Literature, and more recently, Qu'appelle ton destruction, Heidegger, Derrida. We are delighted to have you with us today, especially in light of the extensive conversation that Jews Out of the Question engages in with your own work. Gil, please.
Thank you. I'm delighted and honored to be here. Thank you, Karma, for having organized this. Thank you, Elad, for the book. I'm really delighted to be in such august company to discuss the book. And I feel somehow strange because I was actually looking at the OED and all the possible meanings of the word anti, and I couldn't actually decide which anti I was actually going to try to occupy. I should say that in case it's not clear for those who know me, that anti is probably my favorite word. I too have participated along with Jonathan Jodaken, who is here, and of course with Elad, in multiplying the anti-anti. And so I think I will actually not say much about the anti, although I certainly encourage you to actually look at the OED. Those of you who are not, classical Greek fluent speakers, the word is very interesting. So having said that about the anti, I should also say that I do have a problem at this particular moment, because there's a part of me that actually agrees with everything that Elad says. Not only because I do think it's absolutely crucial to engage with anti-Semitism and to try to understand what it's about, and the engagement actually that Elad proposes all the way to Jean-Luc Nancy, which seems to me at this point to be one of the most significant figures of, how should I put it, in order not to be too anti, the best and the worst of anti-Semitism. And so I want to reiterate, in fact, my agreement with everything that Elad says. At the same time, in another recent Zoom panel, I was actually made aware of a book that I should have known about by Patrick Wolf on the trace of history. And so I started looking at it just a few days ago, and I was completely depressed, I have to say, because the first footnote of Patrick Wolf's The Trace of History, let me read it to you so you all know. Those of you who have read Elad's book will recognize, of course, the echoes. Following Hannah Arendt, I spell anti-Semitism, no hyphen, no uppercase, with a lowercase s, on the ground that there is no such thing as Semitism. It's so strange and depressing that someone like Patrick Wolf would not recognize that there is such a thing as Semites, and that anti-Semitism does, with all due respect, of course, to, as Elad puts it in the book, to the original German, because we've got to be a pure philologist and recognize where the word is created, as if the notion of Semites in German at the time when Wilhelm Marr comes up with, actually, that's not entirely philologically correct, but we'll go with that, comes up with the term. Of course, the notion of Semites has not been established enough that we don't need to mark it. There's no real Semites. And again, you'll understand the difference. So we're here to discuss the anti. We're here to discuss political epistemology. And I do want to register that it was interesting to me to read about political epistemology in this context, because as you may know, someone like Frank Wilderson has been actually deploying the term political ontology, a term that has already a venerable echo. And he deploys the terms political ontology in order to argue that if you can already talk about political epistemology, it means that you're talking about who he calls, somehow controversially, I'll admit, the junior partners of white supremacy, right? Political ontology in the case of Afro-pessimism is that which actually recognizes that Blacks do not exist, right? Are not given enough ontological status to actually be worthy of knowledge. And so the debate in which Elad participates is one where we might recognize that at least there is a discourse of knowledge and a recognition of a certain knowledge that can be deployed, right, to oppose political epistemology to political ontology. So as I was reading and rereading and rethinking, I had a moment, and perhaps I got lost in all the antis, I had a moment when I had to wonder what exactly we are reading about in Elad's book. Are we reading about Semites and anti-Semites, as Bernard Lewis had as a title, which I really regretted he had, because I really wanted that title by the time I started writing, but it was taken. So are we learning about Semites and anti-Semites? The answer is, I mean, the answer to all the propositions I'm going to make is going to be yes, but no, right? So Semites and anti-Semites, anti-Semite and Jew, as the translation of Sartre has it, about Christians and Jews, about Germans and Jews, but let's be fair, some of the French too, about philosophers and Jews. At the most explicit level, we're reading about Semites and anti-Semites, yes? Which is to say, at some level, philosophers and philosophers. Philosophers, right? Real philosophers, as it were, and to echo the discussion of Heidegger, the philosophers who stop being philosophers the moment they are anti-Semites or the moment they start talking about Jews. So real philosophers versus philosophers. It's certainly about real philosophers responding to philosophical anti-Semitism, or to anti-Semitism, not just philosophical. Now, we're not actually after, as you might expect, after reading Heidegger, after the unthought, although that, of course, is relevant. But we, and recalling political epistemology, we are actually after the unknown, right? We want to recognize, and this is, of course, one of Elad's provocation, we want to recognize that anti-Semites know, yes? They know something. They are deploying a discourse of knowledge, and their philosophical opponents, on the other hand, the anti-Semites, are people who don't want to know, right? They are people, as Elad documents, who actually think that Jews should not be talked about, and that the problem with the anti-Semites is precisely that they bring Jews into philosophical discourse. So what is it that anti-Semites know about? And what is it that their opponents don't want to know about? Well, the answer, and you remember I gave you a few options as to what the book, what kind of what kind of dialogue or non-dialogue, what kind of dialectic or non-dialectic the book is staging. We are certainly hearing about an object, which is the Jews. So then we are back at philosophy or philosophers and the Jews. So do real philosophers know Jews? Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Maimonides, Horkheimer, Rosenzweig. Philosophers know Jews. I mean, there's much more, and Elad, of course, doesn't need to be made aware of that. Philosophers know Jews. Or perhaps they only think Jews, rightly or wrongly, depending on which philosophers we read. But one of the takeaways seems to be that philosophers should know Jews. Yes, that is, after all, the point of political epistemology. They should know Jews, or at least they should know the Talmud, right? Now, one of the questions that keeps being reiterated in Elad's book is, why Jews, right? It's a question that occurs at many moments. So why Jews? Or perhaps I should say, who knows Jews? Who should know Jews? And for some reason, call it my abandonment of secularism, I kept thinking that if we're going to talk about knowledge, you know, that which is in front of us is not know thyself, yes? That is not our tradition. Our tradition, as far as I can tell, says, Da lifnemi ata omed. Yes? Da lifnemi ata omed. Know in front of whom you stand. So who knows Jews? Who should know Jews? I have in mind, of course, that famous exchange that Hannah Arendt tells Scholem of meeting Golda Meir, and Golda Meir telling Arendt that she believes in the Jewish people. And Arendt, as you all remembered, is horrified. Yes, a people that used to believe in God Almighty now only believes in itself. So Kant knew Jews, and maybe we want to join him. And as you remember, Kant in the Anthropology calls them Palestinians among us. Palestinians among us. Now, I don't want to take too much time, but I want to point to a very interesting kind of rhetorical insistence that the book, again, really powerfully documents. We all remember that Sartre told us that the anti-Semite invents the Jew, right? The anti-Semite makes the Jew. The anti-Semite constructs the Jew. Whether or not Sartre was correct is saying that, you know, if the anti-Semite didn't invent the Jew, there would be no Jew or whatever. It is an interesting moment, right? The anti-Semite makes the Jew. In the second phase of anti-Anti-Semitism, as Elad puts it, the making is reversed. It is the Jews who make anti-Semitism. They create anti-Semitism, the creation of anti-Semitism by the Jews. If you go to the third phase and to Jean-Luc Nancy, we're told that the West should stop making, right? Any project, la communauté désœuvrée, right? No work, the inoperative community, we should stop making. And so the question is, isn't it strange that as we talk and think and know about anti-Semitism and the relationship between anti-Semites and Jews, philosophers and Jews, Christians and Jews, the language of making and the language of construction is so very insistent. So in the spirit of recalling a certain importance of destruction, I want to read what is unfortunately one of my favorite and also one of my least favorite passages of that apparently great intellectual. I mean, objectively, he was a great intellectual, and he appears, of course, at length in Elad's book. Shlomo Zahn seems to have decided that he's going to be one of our new saints. And I refer, of course, to the inaugural lecture that Ernest Renan gave in 1862, as he was assuming the chair of Semitic studies at the Collège de France. I've quoted that a few times, but given that there's 184 of you here, I'm hoping, I don't know if I'm hoping, I'm also sad that you may hear those lines for the first time. This is the chair of Semitic studies that has just been created for Ernest Renan, and Renan is giving the opening lecture, you know, like Foucault on the order of discourse, opening lecture. After having discussed the contribution of Jews, Muslims, Phoenicians to civilization, Renan talks to us about the future of Europe. And he says the following: the Muslim East defeated the West, right? Had better arms and a better political system, sent its riches, knowledge, civilization. Henceforward, the parts are changed. European genius rises with peerless grandeur. Islamism, Renan says Islamism, not Islam. Judaism, Christianism, Islamism. Islamism, on the contrary, is slowly decomposing. Nowadays, it is failing with a crash. At the present time, the essential condition of a diffuse civilization, is the destruction of the peculiarly Semitic element, la chose sémitique par excellence, the destruction of the theocratic power of Islamism, consequently the destruction of Islamism itself, for Islamism can exist only as an official religion, merely as a state religion, he goes on, and then he says, there is the endless strife, la guerre éternelle, the strife which will cease only when the last son of Ishmael shall have died of misery, or shall have been driven by terror into the depth of the desert. Islam completely negates Europe. Islam is fanaticism. Islam is contempt for science, suppression of civil society. It is the appalling simplicity of the Semitic spirit, cramping the human intellect, closing it against every delicate thought, every fine feeling, every rational inquiry, to confront it with an eternal repetition. God is God. Da lifnei ata omed. Thank you. Thank you, Elad.
Thank you very much, Gil. Okay, I'm looking forward also to hearing Elad's thought about what you said. But now we're going to continue to our next speaker, who's Vivian Liska. It's so good to see you again, Vivian. Vivian is a professor of German literature and director of the Institute of Jewish Studies in the University of Antwerp, Belgium. She's also a distinguished visiting professor in the Faculty of the Humanities at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She has published extensively on literary theory, German modernism, and German Jewish authors and thinkers. She's the editor of the book series Perspectives on Jewish Texts and Context. Her recent books include When Kafka Says We, Uncommon Communities in German Jewish Literature, Giorgio Agamben's Lehrer Messianismus, Fremde Gemeinschaft, Deutsch-Jüdische Literatur der Moderne, and German Jewish Thought and Its Afterlife, A Tenuous Legacy. Okay, so please go ahead, Vivian. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karma. So I have a title. My title is an anti, Roses for Elad. In her poem, Sacred Emily, Gertrude Stein famously quipped, "A rose is a rose is a rose." First, dear Elad, a gesture to express my admiration and gratitude for this exciting, original, and inspiring book. I've come here to present you with a little bouquet of roses. They are field roses, the field of Jewish and anti-Semitism studies, of rhetoric and logic. But it is literature, my own field, that has provided me with both my title and my theme. Is a rose really a rose the second and third time around? Does Gertrude Stein's tautology intensify the roseness of the rose as medieval philosophers, Duns Scotus, Thomas Aquinas, or even Leibniz would believe? If so, the expression would refer to the thisness, the hexitas of the rose, and would reveal its essence. Or does the repetition turn the referent rose from a flower into a word, then into the quote of a word, the quote of the word? In that case, the first rose would refer to a flower, the second to a statement about referring to a flower, and the third turns the sentence into the verse of a poem. You polemic against anti-Semitism, which you yourself repeatedly call anti-Semitism, raises a question. Does a triple negation end up in a positive or in the intensification of a negative? I looked it up, and the most convincing answer I found was that in proper English, such triple constructions should be avoided unless the author, I'm quoting, wants it to be colorful. And colorful it is, your book and your argumentation. So here's a rose to start with. Now, is your book's position of anti-Semitism itself an intensification of a negation? Or does it transform the whole? In your case, maybe not into the verse of a poem, but into a colorful, unexpected argument. After all, just as two negatives become a positive, three negations may yield an even more positive than two negatives. So, to get this straight, the first anti in anti-Semitism is a negation of the Jew. Is the second anti, a negation of the Jew, a positive? As your book convincingly shows, this is only seemingly so. In reality, you claim the second negation is not a reversal of anti-Semitism, but a complicity with it. In other words, the opposition to anti-Semitism is complicit with anti-Semitism. My guiding question will obviously concern the third, your anti. Does it represent a reversal of the anti-Semitism you so resourcefully criticize, or rather a form of complicity with it? You define anti-Semitism as the, quote, desemanticization of the Jew, an emptying out of the Jew's epistemic content. More simply stated, you claim that anti-Semitic discourses don't grant the existence of Jewish thought. You show that anti-Semitism, far from its pretense to fight anti-Semitism, in fact collaborates in this emptying out, presumably because anything said of the Jew is considered stereotypical, a generalization, a negation. Anti-Semitism accords thus no affirmation of a positive episteme to what you call the Jewish. At first glance, as a negation of a negation, anti-Semitism should rescue a positive content of the Jewish, but you show that it instead merges with this negation. What happens then, I wonder, when you, in turn, contest this attitude? Before exploring this question, I promised you a bouquet from my rose garden. So that is where I will really start, with my roses. I want to give you three. My first rose. Your book brings powerful evidence to bear on a provocative, daring, and counterintuitive thesis. You intend to slaughter sacred and less sacred cows, among them the acknowledged theoreticians of anti-Semitism, Adorno and Horkheimer, Sartre, Arendt, and others. Marshalling an impressive variety of registers, theories, and thinkers, your study is not only erudite, it also intervenes in often astonishing ways in dominant discourses and radically challenges habitual thought processes. Your anti indeed leads not, as logic would have it, to a return to anti-Semitism, but to a surprising place. Your book reads like a thriller full of suspenseful twists and turns. My second rose. Your argument offers a subtly executed critique of certain ways of opposing anti-Semitism. It is startling and utterly convincing on at least two of its central points. I could not agree more with your critique of reducing the Jew to victimhood and Shoah. More importantly, and specific to your book, I'm impressed by your critique of de-epistemizing the Jew, of emptying it of all positive characteristics. In my own work, I point to a similar dynamic of depletion in Giorgio Agamben, Jacques Derrida, Judith Butler, Alain Badiou, and of course, most notoriously in Jean-Paul Sartre's Jew as creation of the anti-Semite. In each case, in the name of fighting anti-Semitism, the Jew is taken to epitomize non-identity, non-place, and no time. Your study is an eye-opener towards other thinkers and theories, showing that this phenomenon is far more pervasive than I had expected. My third rose. Your book articulates an alternative to what it is that is desemanticized and depleted in anti-Semitic theories. I myself hesitate to spell this out, mainly out of fear of essentializing, fixing, pinning down, and narrowing our understanding of what is Jewish. A similar hesitation is, I believe, possibly shared by some, though not all, the anti-Semites you address. Yet, I can accompany you a fair distance toward where you end up. And if I give this away now, I am aware that I'm a spoiler of your thriller or treasure hunt. This treasure is the Talmud, the core of rabbinic Judaism. If I were asked to re-semanticize the Jewish, that is where I too would go, though possibly for different reasons than you. In brackets, you explicitly reject conceiving of the Talmud as a document for the organization of everyday life in terms of negotiated righteousness and justice. But your insistence that this is the treasure of Judaism, a treasure rarely invoked in oppositions to anti-Semitism, is a major contribution to the discourse about Jews, both past and present. Now, Elad, it is in the nature of roses to have thorns. In our case, they consist of questions about your argumentation, your definition of both anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism, and indeed your telos, the Talmud. So here's a thorn for each of my roses in quick enumeration. A thorn attached to my first rose, my admiration of your daring argument. It seems to me that the provocative power of your argumentation comes at the price of radical and occasionally truly excessive and dizzying paradoxes and reversals. Some striking examples will follow. And here's a thorn adorning my second rose, your justified critique of many versions of anti-Semitism. Your definition of both anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism is somewhat contentious. Is anti-Semitism really the, I quote, banishment of the collective subjectivity from the realm of knowledge and discourse of philosophy? Is this not a disembodiment of the term? At some point, you suggest that this depletion is, quote, worse than extermination. I presume you mean this metaphorically. As to your definition of anti-Semitism, you yourself show such a variety of figures and dynamics of desemanticization that I wonder if they really constitute a category at all. Furthermore, aren't there other anti-Semites who don't desemanticize, or else are themselves critical of such desemanticizing? See, for example, Blanchot's critique of Sartre. So aren't there degrees of desemanticization that ought to be reckoned with? In a similar vein, you offer a fascinating rapprochement between Arendt and Alain Badiou. But their differences in matters Jewish, I think you will agree with me, seem to be far greater than the similarities. Finally, my last thorn concerns your positive alternative, the treasure to be found announced at the beginning of your book and uncovered really only at its end, the Talmud. As I said, I'm fully with you there, but I have a few questions. What about those Jews who would not identify with this episteme? Would you leave them out in the cold, exposed to an unredeemable or for that matter, anti-Semitism? And why not leave the semanticizing of the Jew, the filling the Jewish with content and knowledge, and leave to the anti-Semite the more limited task of warding off those who threaten the Jews in their activity? This brings us to your epilogue, which gives the Talmud center stage and deserves a close reading of its own, which I will save for a longer conversation over a glass of wine. It is the most daring, the wildest, the most exciting, and also the most controversial part of your book. It proposes that Heidegger, of all people, can serve to restore what was neglected, depleted, forgotten, and negated in discourses of anti-Semitism. I quote Heidegger as pathway to the Talmud. This key statement of your epilogue sounds like a salto mortale, a lethal leap developed in several dangerous somersaults, however artfully constructed. They are, in any case, too intricate to be reconstructed here in full. So allow me the briefest of summaries of your argument linking Heidegger and the Talmud together with a short battery of questions. You say that both Heidegger and the Talmud represent the quote, quote, other of Western thought, which comprises post-Socratic Greek philosophy, Christianity, biblical Judaism, together they form the Judeo-Christian, and last but not least, strikingly, Nazism. You expose this medley's common characteristics, a will to power and mastery, and especially in the case of Nazism and the Bible, a common affirmation of such problematic foundational figures as origin, election, and blood and soil ideology. But the common denominator of their adversaries on the good side of the barricades, namely Heidegger and the Talmud, is somewhat less clear. Your Heidegger in these final pages is surprising, but quite clearly delineated. He is portrayed as anti-Semitic only insofar as he is anti-biblical, which means here anti-prophetic, so against a mastery of the future, anti-theological, so against the certainty of a monotheistic God, and anti-Heimat, against the refusal of estrangement. So this is what Heidegger has in common with the Talmud. Is the Talmud, like Heidegger, anti all of these, above all the Bible? You officiate almost as a Mesader Kiddushin over the marriage of this anti-biblical Heidegger and an equally anti-biblical Talmud. But not having said much about the Talmud, you introduce on the final 2 pages of your book an altogether different way of reading Heidegger, presumably because this is the only way in which your argument can reach its destination, the Talmud. You reach it in Lacoulabart's quote of Blanchot about the Jew, quote, as incarnating the rejection of myth, renunciation of idols, recognition of ethical order manifest in respect of the law. It just so happens that this quote is embedded in Lacoulabart's critique of Heidegger. So here's to end my quick battery of questions. By the time we get here, haven't we already turned our backs to Heidegger? Why then the detour via Heidegger altogether? Furthermore, in alluding to the post-colonial critique of the West exploiting the rest, aren't you depoliticizing this critique by turning the anti-Judeo-Christian, anti-Greek, anti-philosophical Heidegger into the rest of the West, usually reserved for the victims of colonialism, of Occidental supremacy and the like? More fundamentally, is the Talmud really the other, not only of Western thought, but of the Bible? This would require more elaboration than you are willing to give us. Allow me to briefly switch to your side. Why don't you invoke aspects of the Talmud that could indeed be construed in similar terms as your Heidegger? Your Heidegger a seafarer rather than a farmer, more wanderer than homebound recluse and associating exile with the mournful absence of the gods? You could, and I'm grateful to Leora Batnitsky for pointing this out to me, mention the Talmud as diasporic rather than heimatlich. Similarly, you could quote passages in the Talmuds lamenting the loss of the prophetic proximity of God, to God, which could possibly resonate with Heidegger's Hölderlin mourning the departure of the gods. Instead, Elad, your Talmud, with the exception of the final sentence that describes it in the most general, not necessarily Jewish terms as, quote, the performative language of the law, remains itself a discourse of negation, depleted of specificity, and at least performatively in your own discourse, devoid of epistemic fullness. The treasure unearthed at the end of your book looks dangerously desemanticized and negative, anti-biblical, anti-Judeo-Christian, anti-Greek, and thus, God forbid, complicit with all the anterior antis? Does your thriller end with the discovery of the palest of harassed victims of a corpse? These are, of course, merely questions as thorns attached to my roses for debate, discussion, machloikes. They are simply the evidence of the inspiring challenge presented by your book. So maybe, and here's my own salto mortale, my questions are not the thorns, but the real roses I want to present to you here. I'm looking forward to their answers in your next book. Maybe even, I dare to hope, a book about the Talmud. Thank you.
Woo! These were lovely roses and of course thorns as well. Thank you very much, Vivian. Okay, so now we're with Menachem Lorberboim. Menachem Lorberboim is the Vice Dean of Humanities. He teaches Jewish philosophy at Tel Aviv University. He's also a founding member of the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He's author of Politics and the Limits of the Law. We are dazzled by his beauty and I seek thy countenance. And he's one of the senior editors of the Jewish Political Tradition series. Finally, he just completed a study on Hasidism as a model of Jewish religious revitalization in early modernity. And I think we all of us share the expectation to take this book into hand as soon as it sees light. So thank you, Menachem, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kalma. Thank you, Elad, for this, for giving us this occasion to come together, all of us together, really from all over the world. It's such a pleasure to see not only you and to celebrate with you, but so many friends from all over, and really, really, really special. I will actually pick up exactly from where Vivian left. So we'll keep the course and the thread of thought going, because I don't wish to recast or represent Elad's work, but rather to converse with him. Most especially, I would like to elaborate on the very last suggestive move of the book, the call to reconsider the Talmud as a font of Jewish denken. Now, it's not difficult to persuade someone like me that this is a worthy path, because I am a product of the yeshiva world and have spent my life studying Talmud. But reflecting on what this possibly means is a task unto itself. And maybe it's better for those who love Talmud not to reflect on what they're doing, but simply to enjoy it. I'm not sure, but I do wish to join with you in thinking. The hermeneutic circle of the book, describing the tragic bond between anti-Semitism and anti-Anti-Semitism, has many refractions. One has to do with one of the most dramatic embracements of the circle itself, which is Zionist politics. Zionist politics is characterized by bipolarity between a very stark realism that argued that in Europe of nation states, Jews will not have a future. And they were right. But what they suggested and proposed was a radical utopianism of a Jewish political entity in Palestine. And I think that if we look upon the different leaders in the Zionist movement, down to Benjamin Netanyahu himself, we can see how these people have completely lived their lives, their political lives, in playing out this duality, sometimes in ways that are almost startling to see. Now, a profound implication of Galut existence is that being Jewish means being theologically, politically implicated. To live as a Jew in exile within Christendom or Islam means to be identified as other, and as other because you do not participate in the polity. And you do not participate in the polity because of your theological placing. In this sense, I mean that being Jewish means being theologically, politically implicated, and unescapingly so. Enlightenment politics was the attempt to rid Jews of this curse. But Zionism illustrates, Zionism illustrates, at the very least, why an alternative politics that would be Jewish are so precarious. Zionist politics oscillates in a polar fashion between power politics of realism to the inability to live up to its utopia. It leaves Jewish being exposed. Normalcy becomes a veneer for the pestering doubt or suspicion, the persisting doubt or suspicion as well, that being theologically, politically implicated is not so easily done away with. But this reflection is not an indulgence in being facetious. Political Zionism has taken Jews a great step beyond their previous existence, even if it is still enmeshed in the very discursive structures devoted to annihilating the Jewish. So what would be, or what would a different horizon of thought look like? The hermeneutic circle that Elad analyzes is a crucial manifestation of an ontological structure of modernity that might be perhaps well articulated by combining the thought of Martin Heidegger and that of Carl Schmitt. I do not mean decisionism, which is one important moment of their intersection, but rather a more fundamental point, that they provide together an ontological scheme, which I too have called a political ontology, crucial to Western metaphysics and its ontological manifestation. For Heidegger, how being is thought is ontologically articulated as the ontotheological moment of Western political thinking. For Schmitt, political theology is how power is legitimated and gives us a course of thought for legitimating practice. So here we have an interesting meeting of ontology and of practice, where ontotheological structures are actually accompanied and reflected and mirrored on the level of practice by the structure of political theology. and they go hand in hand together. And they have a very long history, and actually not necessarily wed to the modern as Schmidt thinks, or at least says sometimes. Now, against this background, it seems to me that thinking through Talmud means thinking that precedes these two elements of Western metaphysical thought. And try to think before this, or trying to think Talmud as Talmud thinks Talmud, is actually an undoing of probably one of the deepest moves that was done in the past 1,000 years in Jewish theology, which is a complete embracement of ontotheological structures. On this level, there's no difference between Jewish philosophy or Jewish theological philosophy and Kabbalah. Both are completely structured according to the ontotheological model, and the 10th century really signifies in this respect a profound theological turn in Judaism. Thinking Talmud then is not only an alternative to the modern appropriations of these structures, but actually calls upon us to think outside of the very fundamental structures of thought that the Rishonim, the medieval rabbis who bequeathed the Talmudic world to us, embraced completely. And this is not an easy, this is not easy and not a simple exercise of thought. It's a radical undoing of traditions of thinking and of traditions of learning. But if we return to these two elements of ontotheology and political theology, and think about them for a moment, so we can say that definitely the Talmud is not defies ontotheological structures. It is not subordinate to scientific structures of thinking. It is not dualistic in its understanding of the relation of body and soul, and it is not foundationalist. And I think just to think of one of the most radical meanings of thinking Talmud outside or before the theological turn in Judaism itself means, for example, to realize that all major Jewish currents of the past 1,000 years believe in a soul that's radically different from the body. But this isn't the Talmud's position. If you would mention it to any yeshiva student today, it would seem not only strange to them, but profoundly counterintuitive to the very meaning of religiosity. So this is just to illustrate how far-reaching these alternative that the Talmud is as an alternative structure. If we turn to the political theological element, here I want to focus on the Mishnah, because I think the Mishnah here is really a much more radical text than the Talmud for different reasons. But I think the two things come across very powerfully in the Mishnah. The first is that the Mishnah, on my understanding, or the Mishnah's understanding of what a communal life is made up of two important elements. One is that I believe that the Mishnah is an attempt to provide a regime without a rule, a regime without a rule. In this way, it's either highly utopian or, you might say, highly theocratic. That is, that the only real or the most profound moment of normativity is not achieved through the powers of enforcement of equality, but the internalization of the call of the norm in the form of a mitzvah. The second important element that I think makes up the Mishnaic thought is that the Mishnah addresses itself to a community. It does not address itself to a collective, to an institutionalized collective. Or to put otherwise, I think it is fair to say of the entire rabbinic tradition that each Jewish community is an instantiation of a collective that is nowhere to be found. Now, this creates a unique moment in rabbinic thought where the Jewish collectivity of Knesset Israel is completely reified, but completely severed from existence. It exists nowhere. It exists in its particular instantiations and communities and the way Jews imagine themselves. Now, when we think of the Talmud in these terms, that is, first of all, in how it defies onto-theological commitment, how profoundly other its concepts of politics are, we see that a return to Talmud is, or a call to a return to Talmud is by no means a simple task, because it really means thinking not only out of modernity, it means thinking out of at least 1,000 years of what Jews have considered Jewish theology to be. Now, I don't claim that this is impossible. I think it's one of the most worthwhile engagements there is in Jewish theological reflection. I think that this is really the heart of it, and is also an alternative to the Zionist alternative to Talmud, which was a return to the Bible. As my teacher David Hartman of blessed memory used to say, the Bible is not a Jewish book. And I think he hit upon something very true and very, very troubling, but that needs further exploration. But what this means is that on this reading, the creation of a Jewish nation state is a profound negation of the Talmud. It's not only a negation because of the return to the Bible, but because the attempt to resituate Jewish collectivity geographically, which not surprisingly was understood certainly by the second Aliyah to Eretz Israel at the beginning of the 20th century as a return to the body. But is this indeed the case? What would a return to serious engagement with the Talmud look like against the background of an existing Jewish nation state? What would this mean? I think that these questions are deeply troubling, deeply challenging, and I don't think that they've been seriously articulated as yet. And in this respect, what I'm saying is also that the ultra-Orthodox Haredi claim to be authentic to the rabbinic tradition is just as questionable as the Zionist claim to be authentic to the Bible. But I think that the challenge of what seriously considering the Talmud as a departure point for Jewish theological and normative reflection, what it would mean after 1,000 years of Jewish theology and after 100 years or more of a Zionist revolution in Judaism are profound questions that we can only begin imagining. But what they do give us is at least a different horizon. So thank you very much, Elad, for inviting us to that horizon again, and perhaps giving us a very important tool of how to leave behind what Europe has bequeathed to us. Thank you very much.
תודה רבה, מנחם. Elad, it seems that you're doomed to write another book on the Talmud. I hope you're okay with that. So now we're right on time and we can turn to you, and you're welcome to formulate your response to the three speakers, and then in the time that we will have left, if we will have any time left, then it will be time for questions. Elad.
Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Good evening, everybody, for showing up. And thank you, Karma and Itamar, for organizing this evening. And thank you, Gil and Vivian and Menachem, for this amazing reflections, for reading the book and thinking about it, and formulating for me so interesting reflections on it, both roses and the thorns. As Vivian said, I'm not sure what I like more, the roses or the thorns, and you're right, Vivian, that Machlokes is about the thorns. You are all really friends, not only friends, but friends in thought, which means that when I write my thoughts, you are the people I speak to, and I am deeply, deeply grateful for you for giving life to my book, for reading it, talking about it. I'm very moved and very honored. I'm supposed to respond, and I will. However, I will do that by a certain reflection that I will present now, and along the way there are some thoughts that I would like to express, and along the way I will also respond, I think, to a few of the ideas that you expressed, not to all of them, and not on the level that they should be addressed. Okay, so I want to first a little vote about the experience for me of this event. It's the first time that there is an event for my book, and you know Plato's argument about the primacy of speech over writing, right? Plato says the speaker, when you speak, you can defend your words, and a writer cannot do it. So this is why logos is better than writing. Now, the assumption, of course, is that the speaker wants to defend their words, right? So there is an assumption that there is an identification between the speaker and the words, which is probably true when you're speaking. However, as the anti-logocentrism taught us, writing also allows you the distance. It allows you to take a distance from the word. And I have to say that at some moment of rereading my book and hearing you and thinking about it, I also experienced a certain desire of defending myself against my own words and taking a distance from this identification, to look at my book with you from a distance. However, against this desire that I feel, I will invoke Sartre, which will be important here, who talked about your role in a certain situation. So in this situation, I am called to defend this book that I wrote and to, in a sense, embody it. So I will do it. I will not criticize my book. I will defend my book. I want to do so by situating this book in my own personal situation of writing it, right? My own situation, my own circumstances, where this book is coming from, and with something which is not discussed in the book, and which is some people ask me about, and why didn't I discuss it in the book? And it should, maybe it should, I will do it now. So in a few steps, I indeed feel that the question of situation is always important, but I do feel that this book has especially important for the situation because it is not a book that I, strictly speaking, wanted to write. Okay, this is not the book I wanted to write. I wanted to write something more on the line of what Vivian asked and what Menachem talked about. This book is more, or I would say, a shadow or negative of the book that I wanted to write. It's full with negatives. And I shortly want to explain this. And I will explain it according with some words about my own situation vis-a-vis philosophy, Jewish thought, and anti-Semitism. So about my own situation vis-a-vis Jewish thought, I would say it's a Sartrean position. Okay, now Sartre, for those of you maybe you know, who read my book know that, and maybe most of you know it. Sartre, his controversial thesis, it was already mentioned here, that the Jewish consciousness is something that happens, something that is made, created by the gaze of the non-Jew. The non-Jew looks at the Jew as a Jew, and by this gaze, the Jew becomes a Jew. Not only the non-Jew, of course. Sartre was talking about the anti-Jew, the anti-Semite. Okay, now this thesis of Sartre, right, the gaze of the anti-Semite or the non-Jew creates the Jew, received a lot of criticism. My own book, in the chapter 2, I criticize it. And of course, the critique, according to my own lines, it's disregarding positive Judaism, Jewish tradition, culture, religion, knowledge, philosophy. Okay, so this is the critique. But I have to say that already by writing, but also after writing the book, I started thinking that Sartre did identify something which is true. It's a real phenomenon of modernity, right? Of the assimilated or the non-Jewish Jew. Okay, the non-Jewish Jew who doesn't feel any identification, knowledge with Jewish tradition, and he's Jewish by what you can call, with Heidegger and Sartre, thrownness, right? He was born into a certain role in the world, into a certain positiveness of Judaism in the world, which for him is not a geist, but something like a ghost. He's haunted by it. Okay, there are different echoes. Somehow he needs to face these ghosts that haunt him. For instance, the most clear example is, of course, these stereotypes from the gaze of the non-Jew and so forth, what Sartre called anti-Semitism, but just today you can just as well feel it by phallosemitism. And I think that to pay tribute, the recent collection of articles about Sartre's text that was edited by Vivian herself and by Manuela Consoni about this book indeed wonderfully shows how, if you take this figure of the Jew that Sartre talks about, indeed it's a very similar then analysis to what happens with gender and with race, and indeed Sartre's theory was very successful there. So I feel myself, my personal situation, indeed similar to this, to Sartre's Jew, but I have to say more specifically, and now to nod to Menachem, I'm not the construct of the Jew that Sartre was describing. I'm a construct of the social political constellation that was created to some extent exactly in order to exorcise this ghost of the Judaism. Right, the secular, non-Jewish Jewish state, right? They liberate the Jews from anti-Semitism by liberating them from the spectral Judaism is, for very important foundational thinkers of Zionism, is explicit purpose. Herzl, Pinsker, you all know them. Also, Sartre talks exactly about Zionism, and we all know this raises a lot of big questions. However, it was, to some extent, in my case, successful. It did work. When I was in Israel, a secular Jew, non-Jew, I was not interested in Jewish thought. I was interested in philosophy. I have no interest in Jewish thought. I even have an aversion against something like that. I did not perceive the Jewish as thought. I did not see something that is thought there. And like Sartre Jew, I did start to face this question only when I came out of Israel, only in the diaspora, when indeed I exactly experienced this gaze of non-Jewish society, non-Jewish academia, I have to say, that and where I only became not even perceivable as a Jewish philosopher. So this is about the real personal situation. Now, Sartre talks about two ways of coping with this gaze. Two ways for the non-Jewish Jew to return the gaze, the non-Jewish gaze. Now, the first strategy is to say, to deny it, I'm not Jewish. Okay, what Sartre calls inauthentic. Another way, what Sartre calls authentic, is to assume the role, to say, I'm in this situation, I will assume the role. Now, for Sartre, what assume means was fighting anti-Semitism. Okay, anti-Anti-Semitism, and this I criticize, exorcism, Zionism. This was his solution. For me, I did start by denial. Eventually, I decided to face the ghosts and to search for the Geist. And as a philosopher, I was trying to develop from philosophy a certain approach to something like Jewish thought, or with Foucault, episteme, which is not just culture, but something which is on the level of philosophy. This is what I wanted. This was the project. I still want to do it. However, and now I get to the question of Heidegger with Vivian. What does it mean to approach Jewish thought from philosophy? Now, the meaning of that depends on who is your philosopher. Now, if your philosopher is Kant or Hegel, meaning philosophy, something like the discipline of thought as such, conceptual thinking, and so forth, it would mean to show how Jewish tradition is also philosophical, can also think. Jews are like everybody else, they have their philosophy and they can think and do concepts. Okay. In my case, my philosopher was, like Sartre, was Heidegger. Now, I come to Heidegger. For Heidegger, philosophy is not just discipline of thought, anthropologically constant, ahistorical, but philosophy is a specific tradition of thought, right? The Western thought, European thought, whatever you want to call it, onto-theological thought, which is not the only one, and it is not the best one. And it should be, in some way or another, overcome. And this is what I find so fascinating with Heidegger. This is what Heidegger is important for me in this context. Now, I think this thought of Heidegger indeed opened the way to two very important attempts in 20th century thinking. First, the radical critique of Western thought in different ways, but as something specific, which is not absolute. Second, attempts to approach alternative systems of thought, which are not philosophy, especially such that are invisible to philosophy, namely speaking with ghosts. So Heidegger looked for his ghosts in pre-Socratic thought, and Hölderlin, you know the spiel. I, like Levinas, and indeed like Menachem, and I have to say many others, Elliot Wolfson, Daniel Boyarin, Sergei Dolopolsky, Ron Eivel, some of them are here. I'm looking to the direction of rabbinic thought, okay? And indeed, more specifically, not Kabbalah, Talmud. Now, to come close to the recent events, to the recent situation, the recent situation from which this book comes from is the debate around Heidegger's black notebooks. Okay, for many years, everybody knew Heidegger was a National Socialist, or was to some extent involved, compromised at the beginning, yes, after, okay, it was a whole debate. However, for many years, people said he was National Socialist, but he was not, at least he was not anti-Semitic. Okay, so in 2014, they started publishing what is called the Black Notebooks, notes that Heidegger wrote in the 30s, 40s, and later. And the first volumes that were published were those in the 30s and the 40s, so during the Holocaust. And shock, around the 40s, 41, so really the time of the Holocaust, Heidegger writes a few, not a lot, but still few very, very negative, very, very difficult anti-Semitic notes against Jews. Now, a huge debate erupted. It's still ongoing to some extent. I was doing Heidegger at that time, and I was doing Heidegger and Jewish thought. So it was an opportunity. I thought, here's an opportunity. Everybody's talking about philosophy and anti-Semitism and Jews and so forth. I thought this is an opportunity to bring into conversation a confrontation between philosophy, also Heidegger's, also critique of philosophy, with Jewish thought or with Talmud. And this is the book I wanted to write. This is what I planned to write, and this is what I started to write, and this is hopefully will be written. But what happened is, to my great surprise, and I described this in chapter 1 of the book, this was not where the debate was going. This was not the direction. The direction, as you already heard from some of the people who presented my argument, was indeed that actually Heidegger was criticized by the huge absolute majority of the critics, not because he was critical of Jewish thought, not because he said bad things against Jewish thought and against which you should say something good or something different. No, the critique, the essence of the critique, and I show it in the book, was for even suggesting, talking about a Jewish thought, okay? A thought that is specifically Jewish. This was considered the center of the anti-Semitism of Heidegger. So what happened? That anti-Anti-Semitism, this critique of Heidegger, and then I saw it was a much larger tendency, was involved in doing two main things. First of all, effacing Jewish intellectual tradition, Judaism, Talmud, Kabbalah, not only, and what I call, in a sense, was complicit of this extermination, this what now is, there is a term now that says epistemicide, okay? You kill a culture of knowledge, you efface it from the earth, and you know, there is this genocide, epistemicide. What is worse? I will not judge, but this is at least something that I became aware of that is taking place, and is a problem in itself. Now, this is the first thing. The second thing that happened is the effacement or the epistemicide of the Jewish thought, specifically as not identical to Western thought, namely as something that could have been a potential source for critical theory, for critique of the West, and so forth. Now, what happened there is that, again, there is an exemplary position of Jewish thought, and anti-Semitism has become something like defense of Western thought against critique. Now, here, I come very close to what Gil was saying, what Gil was writing, and I also say it in the book, that Jewish thought became something like, or Jews or Judaism, by effacing Jewish thought, which is the other of the West, became in a sense an exemplary case for the defense of the West, which I found, again, problematic on different levels. Now, in order, and this is to explain exactly the situation, in order to be able to write about in Jewish thought or Talmud, I needed to first treat the resistance to Jewish thought in the name of the struggle against anti-Semitism. That is the discursive situation I found myself. And this is the book that I ended up writing, a negative introduction to Talmud. Okay, a negative introduction. It doesn't lead directly to Talmud. It eventually goes to the direction of Talmud, but first it removes a huge obstacle on the way there. That's the situation, and this is where this book is speaking from. Now, just to give you a little teaser or preview, indeed, at that moment, I am writing, Vivian, a book where I exactly treat all the questions that you ask and justly ask. And also, Menachem, the ideas that you discuss are exactly these ideas that I will discuss in the book. Most importantly, or perhaps one of the important questions is Talmud and the Jewish state, and the Talmud and the Bible, which I think are related questions, as you put it. And all these discussions are taking place in an analysis of another philosopher, a student of Heidegger, who tried to use what Heidegger was doing in order to approach Jewish thought, specifically Talmud, Emmanuel Levinas. So the next book, hope next time we all meet like this, is the book about Levinas Talmudic readings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this delightful and liberating Jewish discussion. So we have 5 minutes. I think we can make use of them and perhaps look into a question from the audience. What do you think? Itamar, I didn't get any questions. You didn't get any questions. So I have one here. Okay, question for Elad from Nitzan. Hi, Nitzan. What does the notion of myth do to your understanding of anti-Semitism and anti-Anti-Semitism? I don't recall the term showing in your book. Adopting a semiological and historical analysis of mythic elements of both anti-Semitism and anti-Anti-Semitism would force a general discussion of discourse to unpack its relation to actuality or facts, attach the epistemic to the body, and possibly avoid some of the traps Vivian pointed out in her comment.
Okay, thank you, Nitzan, very, very much for the question. Actually, the myth does play a role in a few moments in the book. One of them is a critical role. If you remember the title of Peter Travny's book that sparked the whole debate was Heidegger and the Myth of Jewish Weltverschwörung. Okay, the plot. And what I criticize precisely through this word is the seeming understanding that every time that if you want to speak about, if you want to attach metaphysical positions, philosophical position, thinking to a specific culture, historical culture, then you immediately, that was Peter Travny's argument, immediately it becomes a myth. And so for him, Heidegger, when he says Jewish thought, it's mythological thought, it's a myth. It cannot be anything else because concrete people don't have, as a collective, thoughts. That's the gist of Peter Travny's argument. So in this context, I exactly criticize this, and I showed how also it appears in other anti-Semitic position. But you're asking about something else, and you're asking about the positive, if I understand, the positive value of the myth in a sense of going from the abstract logos, the concept that has no body, as you say, and grounding it in historical collectives, political collectives, as I said. In this sense, yes. In this sense, I will indeed go in this direction. I'm not sure I will simply stick to the idea of the myth because it's created precisely as a counterpart to logos. So I'm not sure if myth would be the right way to go. If you look at the Talmudic literature, I do agree with Blanchot and Levinas that it's in a sense demythicizing, demythologicizing. So I'm not sure what would be the right way to go, but I agree with you that it will be definitely the direction.
Thank you. So let's go for one more and that's it, okay? So how does anti-Semitism relate to philo-Semitism? Are they the same or how do they differ? This is Isabel Frey, yeah.
Okay, thank you for the question. Okay, obviously, yes, they're not the same. Anti is against, philo is for, they hate, they love. Okay, but the question, of course, means something else. And I think you're absolutely right. There is a sense in which, as I said, this gaze of the non-Jew toward the Jew, beat love, beat hate, carries the stereotypes that to some extent you don't like, you want to deny, or you want to correct. However, my book, and I say it in the introduction, when I criticize anti-Semitism, I at the same time criticize anti-Philosemitism that rejects the love by saying there is nothing to love. There is nothing to hate, there is nothing to love. You cannot love a collective, right? To quote Hannah Arendt, people, you cannot hate a people. A people is nothing that you can be for or against on the level of thought, on the epistemic realm. And this I criticize exactly the same way I criticize anti-Semitism. You can love, you can hate, you can criticize, and you can also like. I mean, right in the Jewish tradition as a religion, there is an important institution, controversial, but of conversion. So you can find it that it makes sense, and you can say, I want to be a part of it. Why not? So you can join the Communist Party, and you can join the Jewish episteme. In this sense, my critique is very similar.
Okay, so now we have to close, and I want to say that it was so much fun, and it was almost like being in a room, and in some ways it was even better, I think. And so thank you very much for coming today, and for the wonderful speakers, and of course for Elad's book. Thank you so much for this book, and let's do more things together, and see you next time.
Thank you very much, Karma. Thank you all.